I am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Welcome back to another edition of Ag Law Today. And we've got Stephanie Fryer-Bradley back in the house. So Stephanie, tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do, and introduce yourself to the listeners, please.
Yeah, so I've become a little bit of a regular here on the podcast. So some of you may have already heard this, but my name's Stephanie Bradley Fryer. I'm an associate with Rinker Law. Also have my own firm based in Texas. I grew up on a family farm and cattle operation kind of in central West Texas, and operate that cattle ranch myself now, and also have a ranch with my husband in Southwest Oklahoma. I went to Texas A&M University, so Carrie and I have that in common, and I have an animal science degree from A&M and ag economics master's also from A&M, and then went to law school there as well, so I just couldn't get away. Also worked for the USDA for a little bit before going to law school, and now I'm a practicing attorney.
So Stephanie, I don't know if I've ever asked you, but what was your favorite class in undergrad with animal science at Texas A&M?
Well, I feel like I had so many good ones, and I felt you may have asked me this before, and I may say something totally different, but when you asked me before, but I'm thinking right now, there was a class that we all called the barbecue class. I don't know if you took it with Dr. Howard Hesby.
I did not. It's legendary.
Yes. So that class, the reason they called it the barbecue class is because it was held at about supper time, and you could opt in to have barbecue during class. But that's not, why I took it. It was how to get a job in agriculture. We did a lot of leadership type things, and Dr. Hesby was just a legend of a man. I actually TA'd for that class after I took it also. So today, looking back, that was one of my favorites. There's so many good ones.
Yeah, Dr. Hesby was one of the reasons why I went to Texas A&M, believe it or not. I went down there to judge livestock. I was recruited down there. And whenever I was there on my recruiting visit, I met Dr. Hesby, and he was so warm. And it just illustrates how important it is for, to have like that warmth and that welcoming attitude towards new visitors that are trying to go to a particular school. So I really admired him. He's always had that warmth around all students.
Yes, that you do make a good point, because when I was visiting law schools, I will say that made a difference of how I was welcomed and where I decided to go. It wasn't just because I wanted to go to A&M again. So, but third time's the charm. I don't think I'll be going back for any more degrees.
One of my favorite classes in undergrad was actually meat science. So what I really loved about that class was that we harvested all three species, cattle, hogs, and a lamb. And it was just a really eye-opening experience for me to really see it from that side of things. So I could honestly say that I've seen livestock production and meat production from birth to packaging. So.
Yes, and I don't know if you know this or not, but I was on the meats judging team, so that was quite the experience. And I enjoyed the class as well, and a great department there at A&M for that. So glad I saw it. Didn't want to go into that industry and live it every day. Let's put it that way.
So today we're talking about all things livestock shows, but not just. It's not just any ordinary era right now. We're now living in a COVID world. And, Stephanie, I've been getting a lot of emails, messages, people reaching out to me on social media about liability issues with livestock shows in this world. And so I just wanted to get your take on things, Stephanie. I know that you and I work together on a blog that's available at rinkerlaw.com/blog. But I wanted to work through some of that. So can you walk me through sort of what your highlights are on the liability issues that livestock shows should think about?
Yes. So livestock shows were a big part of my life. I mean, you can see banners in the background here in my home office. And, when COVID hit, it affected a lot of things. And probably one of the biggest things that we saw in our livestock world was they shut down the Houston Livestock Show due to COVID. And so now we're still here, and rightfully worried about the implications of COVID and trying to keep people well. And so anytime you have, as we all know, we've all seen the recommendations from the CDC and social distancing guidelines and even shutdowns, particularly as there's groups of people get together. And a livestock show is, while it's a special event for livestock, it's a social gathering, and you're going to have a group of people. So a big thing that I would recommend for people who are holding a livestock show in general, but particularly in light of COVID, is that they consider having a liability waiver. And since we are in the world of COVID, that liability waiver should directly address some issues and precautions to take, and some guidelines to follow for participants because of the potential for COVID to be spread.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit. So first of all, what is a liability waiver exactly? And can you summarize what it includes?
So a liability waiver is used at, you might think about it when you go to, maybe you've taken your kids to a trampoline park, or you're doing some type of activity. And it's basically a contract signed between a participant and someone hosting an activity that protects the parties from potential lawsuits that may arise if a person is injured, hurt, or even dies by some danger that's inherent to the activity. So you see it like with sporting events, somebody is running the bases and they break their ankle. Well, that's probably, as long as there wasn't some kind of weird condition out there, that probably, you might run and break your ankle when you're playing ball. So same thing with a livestock show. There's some things that are inherent. A calf might get loose. You might get stepped on, something like that. So those things are considered inherent to the risk of being at a show. But now in today's world, you might also consider, since COVID is what it is right now, that might be considered inherent, an inherent risk that you're taking as well. So this liability waiver may protect the host of a show.
All right, but Stephanie, I think that the problem that I have is that a lot of people think that just simply because the livestock show has a liability waiver, then they're good, they're off the hook. And what are your thoughts on that?
So I like to tell clients and people that I talk to that a liability waiver it's a tool in your toolbox. So it's one aspect that you can do to protect yourself from liability. So yes, having the liability waiver is one tool that you have in your toolbox, but you can also take some additional steps that also will protect you from liability. And we can go into some of those as well that I would recommend.
Okay. Yeah. So talk to me more about that. Like, what are some additional steps that livestock shows should be thinking about in addition to having a liability waiver?
So having the liability waiver, step one, but also at the show, taking some considerations and putting people on notice at the show. So maybe that's having some signs available with the CDC recommended guidelines. Maybe it's placing things on the ground, stickers on the ground. You may have seen them at grocery stores that tell you how far you should social distance, having graphics like that. You could also take steps like having hand sanitizer stations available and recommend that people use them, recommending using face masks or requiring them. And also implementing specifically to a livestock show, taking it steps further and try to implementing some things for your show, like maybe you can hold the show partially or fully outdoors if the weather is nice. Maybe people are allowed to stall outside. At a lot of these jackpots, you're allowed to just tie up to the outside of your trailer if that's available. And so stalling outside, limiting the number of people that can come in and out. Maybe you don't have spectators. So maybe you have a live stream instead of letting people come sit at the stands. So some of these common sense measures that I'm sure many of you have seen other businesses implement, you can tailor that to a livestock show as well.
Okay, so to play devil's advocate, what would you say to the folks who are like, well, I don't want to wear a face mask. People shouldn't have to wear a face mask at a livestock show. How would you respond to that?
Well, first and foremost, I think we should go back to looking at what the state has in place and the federal government has in place. So some of these things you're not going to be able to help. If you want to have a livestock show, you're going to have to require certain things, whether it's a maximum percentage of people of capacity that you can have in there or face mask. So if someone were to ask me if I was in the state of Texas and say we could only have 50% capacity in a certain venue, and they didn't like that, well, I would always reference back to that's the law. And if you don't follow the law and the rules and regulations, then no liability waiver is going to save you if you don't follow those rules. So that's A. So sometimes it's required by law. But also, I understand we're strong-willed people in the agricultural industry, but it's just a safety measure. And if it's what makes you feel comfortable as a host and you want to require that, it's definitely your prerogative. And if people don't want to participate, then you have to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of requiring that. But again, you have to circle back to what are the regulations in your state, because it's on a state by state, county by county, sometimes city by city. Some cities here in Texas require a face mask, the city itself. It's not a state regulation, it's the city. So that's something that you can hang your hat on as a host, a livestock show host.
So I just want to regroup because you made a couple, important points that in the law with all of this social distancing stuff, I feel like it's changing by the week. Right? I mean, depending on when the show is, if you have a show in July or a show in August or September, I mean, with some of the things that we're talking about right now, the law in that particular region or state, I mean, who knows? If we're talking about a show in October, we might have to be shelter in place again. And, we need to be talking about a virtual show. So I think that first and foremost, follow the guidelines in your state, but then have a backup plan. Like, what if there's additional restrictions that are put in place? So I think like having a virtual show as a backup is a good idea.
And I think reserving the right to do so in any of the, the press that you put out on your website, reserving the right to change or amend any of the things that you have in place because of guidelines at the time, or because you just choose to do so for the safety of your exhibitors. I think reserving that right and making sure that it's published for people to see and put them on notice is a good practice right now, because it's just uncharted territory and we don't know what's going to happen.
Exactly. The second point that I really wanted to bring home was that, and we talked about this, that liability waivers are good, they're smart, but they are far from bulletproof, right? And I think the thing is, too, is that as a livestock show, you still have a duty of reasonable care, right? And so there are going to be guidelines, social distancing guidelines, perhaps, at the state and the federal level, but then there's also the duty of care, right? Reasonable care in light of the circumstances. So any thoughts on that, Stephanie?
Right. So that's something you have to keep in mind, whether it's COVID or or we're not dealing with COVID anymore. You do have, what's a duty of reasonable care? And, part of that is just having some common sense and making sure things are safe for your exhibitors and participants, whether, it's from making sure there's not a big ditch that people are going to fall into that you're aware of and they could break their leg and you should have told them about it, to, we should have inquired if people had a fever prior to attending the show. We don't know. It's uncharted territory. Is that a duty of reasonable care? We don't know right now because the courts have not had the opportunity to address it. So liability waivers will protect you, but not if you're just doing things that are beyond common sense and you are not taking reasonable steps to protect your exhibitors. I'll also note that with liability waivers, it just depends on the court and what state you're in as to how effective they are. In some states, they've been, thrown out as, they aren't going to protect people.
Yes.
And particularly if they are not narrow in scope and for the particular activity. So you can't have somebody sign something to say, well, I just any and all activity for any, cattle show that we put on. It needs to be specific for the date, specific for the show itself. And then the activities. And I'd also mention that a lot of these junior activities, you're not only showing animals, but there's, barnyard Olympics and things like that. So you may want to address that in your waiver as an additional activity. I also think it's a good time to bring up that we have minors at, most of these shows. Most of what we're talking about are junior shows. And so it's also up in the air, and courts differ as to whether a parent can sign off on a liability waiver for a minor, and then that will protect the company that's holding the show or the event. We still recommend that it's best practice for both the minor and the parent or guardian to sign the waiver, but just keep in mind that the court may say, nope, that doesn't protect you because minors can't contract.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that there are some states that are strict liability states, and these liability waivers are barely worth the paper that it's written on. But nonetheless, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt to have it. And you bring up a great point about them being specific for that particular event. I know the liability waivers that we've been working on at Rinker Law will state the specific show and date of the show as well.
And I think, you say like they're not, maybe if something does happen, they don't hold up in court in some jurisdictions. But the good thing is that it does put all the participants on notice, and it does show steps, particularly with, the waivers that we've worked on at Rinker Law with COVID, of some specific things to COVID where they're put on notice that if you have these symptoms, you should not, you're telling me you're here because you do not have these symptoms, and they're put on notice. So part of it is just a notice to the exhibitors. And if something were to go down and you had to go to court, it's just another tool in your toolbox. Say, hey, we tried to make them aware. But they didn't have a duty. They didn't show reasonable care because they still showed up when they shouldn't have. Same thing if you had a crazy animal and you knew, and it hurt somebody else. You knew that it probably shouldn't have been there. And if you brought it and it got somebody hurt, that's kind of on you. If you show up and you have a fever and then turns out you had COVID, the responsibility lies on the person that brought it there to begin with.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you also, I like that you brought up about the animal not acting correctly and coming to the show, but because, you're also highlighting the fact that, yes, we're living in a COVID world where these liability waivers are more important now than ever, but they've always been important. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you say that livestock shows should have probably always been having these liability waivers?
Yes. You should have these liability waivers. And right now we're just tailoring them specific for the environment that we're in right now for COVID. But there's all kinds of things can happen when you're dealing with animals specifically. And also, I'd mentioned that in the state, I'm licensed in the state of Texas, and we have some specific protections for livestock show events where you can place some signage where it protects the show host and puts the participants on notice, in addition to having the waivers. So if your state has something like that, in the state of Texas, we do have signs. You have to have very specific language for it to protect you. But you should look at your state, particularly if you're in Texas, because I know for certain that you can put up these signs at the facility, and that gives you some protections. I know, like, I looked in Illinois, and they had an equine act that had some of these protections, but it didn't look to apply to other types of livestock. And in Texas, and maybe some other states, it is expanded to cover all livestock, not just equine and horses.
So let's shift gears and talk about insurance.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on using insurance as a way to mitigate risk?
Yeah, so insurance, while it's going to cost you a little bit of money up front, we're talking about things happening like personal injury, and that can really add up to if somebody does get hurt or, God forbid, dies. That can be a huge bill that you may or may not be able to pay out of pocket. And so insurance is just that added protection so that if you were sued and your insurance covered that cause of loss, that they would pay out for you. But also most liability insurance also includes that they will defend you in court. So they will pay for your legal fees. They will hire an attorney for you. So it's kind of twofold. It gives you that counsel, that legal counsel, and then if you are ordered to pay any judgment, the insurance would pay that up to the limit that you buy. So it's an excellent thing. I would recommend it not only for livestock shows, but for agricultural producers, that they should consider having some type of liability insurance. The important thing to note is that you need to look at your policy and make sure it covers the event or the facilities, whatever you're trying to cover. You need to make sure it's included in your policy. So if you have you just run some cattle and you want to make sure you have a liability policy so that they don't, something gets out, then you're covered if they damage something while they're out. But what if you had like a pumpkin patch where you have a lot of people coming in and out? You may need a different type of coverage. Livestock show, COVID, you'd have to look at your policy and talk to your insurance agent to see if they're going to cover issues related to COVID.
So along those same lines, Stephanie, with insurance, and I think that you make some great points there, but I'd like to go back to where we were talking about with the compliance with whatever the CDC guidelines are or whatever the guidelines are in that particular state or the federal level. The insurance company is not going to come in and defend you if you have violated the law, right? So exactly. I think that not only the compliance with whatever the law is at the date of the show, which we don't know, right? Mm-hmm. But also trying to document your compliance with those guidelines. Would you agree with that?
Yes. And, you hear I don't know, if you've ever dealt with a lawyer, a lot of times the first thing they'll ask you is, well, what do you have in writing? Have you documented it? And so you can do some simple things just to document and keep record that if you are, when I had to go to the doctor's office last week, in and out, we had to have our temperature taken, and they were keeping a record every time. They were saying, this person, their temperature was 98.6 degrees, so they were allowed to come in, and they were keeping that record. So whatever it is that you're implementing, you need to keep a record of that, and that way, if you were called into court, you could provide all that documentation to show the steps that you were taking to mitigate any issues. And also, like you said, if you're not following the law, the insurance it's kind of like the liability waiver. You're not following the law. The liability waiver is not going to save you, and the insurance is not going to save you. So follow the law.
Heck no, they're not. And to your point, I have an insurance dispute right now involving a livestock producer, and one of the first things that the insurance company is asking for are, where are your records? Where are your records? Right.
Yes.
So, I think agriculture producers are notorious for being a handshake culture. But now is not the time, right? To trust that things are just, that people are complying with XYZ. So I think now's the time to start, getting that pen and paper out and or using your smartphone, whatever kind of record keeping system that you want to use.
Yes, I totally agree. And I agree with it's not that we don't trust people, but in the off event that something were to go badly wrong, you just need to have that paperwork to back up your side of the story. That's all it is. For lack of a better term, it is another insurance policy for you. That's kind of just your paperwork insurance to back up what you're saying is true. Because the court doesn't do handshake deals. The court doesn't care what he said, she said. They care about what's on the black and white on the piece of paper.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So Stephanie, let's say worst case scenario, somebody is sick at the show. There's a big outbreak and there's a lawsuit. Okay. And let's just say that people have listened to this podcast and they have all their records, and things along those lines. But what about protecting personal wealth of the people that are involved with the livestock show?
So I think this is a very important piece to touch on. And again, this doesn't matter if it's COVID or just when we go back to regular times post-COVID. But people need to consider having a business entity structure so that they can mitigate their risk by shifting the liability from their personal assets to only the assets of whatever business entity they choose. So a very popular business entity is a limited liability company, an LLC. And so through an LLC, if you held the show, Stephanie and Carrie LLC held this cattle show and there was a COVID, situation and the LLC would be sued, not Stephanie personally, not Carrie personally. My personal assets would be safe as long as we had this business entity set up and we were following certain corporate formalities in running that business. So again, some more record keeping. So it's about shifting that liability using a business entity.
Yeah, and there's, of course, other choices to business entity. Some people like to form a not-for-profit corporation or a for-profit corporation, perhaps a limited partnership. The discussion of the different business entities is probably for another podcast, but there are some choices there that should be examined with your attorney license in your jurisdiction. And Stephanie, I just wanted to know that whatever the business entity is, that should be the name that's on the liability waiver.
Yes.
Right? Not XYZ Cattle Show. It should be that business entity.
Exactly. And I would just reiterate that if you're operating, so I just went out, Stephanie's going to hold this show. And this is why it's so important, especially in the agriculture community, because we have things like land. We have a lot of assets and we may not have, very much cash in the bank, but if somebody sees you personally with all these assets, they think, oh, this is a cash cow. We're going to just get it all. If something happens and I'm operating that show as an individual and they sued me personally, my family's land would be at stake, my livestock, all of my personal interest, my whole livelihood would be at stake. And that's why it's so serious to consider these business entities. If you choose a not-for-profit, you choose an LLC, whatever the business entity, you shift that exposure for that risk to the business entity instead of you personally. So it's a huge thing that people should consider, especially if this is going to be something that you're going to do, many times, or honestly, even just one time, set up that business entity. And I mentioned following certain, depending on what business entity that you set up, you'll follow certain protocols and do some record keeping to ensure that you get that liability protection. So I know a lot of people might go online and they'll set up a business entity, but you really, and I'm not saying this because I want to get your business and charge you for it, but there's certain specific things that an attorney can really help you make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's so that you're getting the most bang for your buck and the most liability protection.
Yeah, I think people sometimes with this kind of stuff, Stephanie, can be a penny wise and pound foolish. And I understand that we're sitting here as attorneys and having this conversation. And I know that, we're not cheap, but imagine how expensive a lawsuit is, and imagine how expensive it would be if that lawsuit, and the claimants that came after your land and your livestock. There's just a lot of risk, and why risk it? Get it done right. These corporate shields, right? So LLCs, corporations, not-for-profit corporations, et cetera, have what's called a corporate shield. And I just wanted to make a few points here that those corporate shields can be pierced. They're not bulletproof. And you mentioned corporate formalities. So if there's a disregard to corporate formalities, so that would be things like not having an operating agreement if you form an LLC, which by the way, I have a client that formed an LLC on his own without an attorney, and he had no idea that he needed an operating agreement. Okay, so operating agreement. If it's a not-for-profit entity, then you need a set of bylaws. Hopefully that set of bylaws has an indemnification clause that says that the members or the board members are not going to be liable for, anything that the not-for-profit corporation gets sued for. If it's a for-profit entity, also bylaw. So that's one. Two, the annual member minutes. And I don't know, but I feel like if there was an audit that a lot of agriculture producers did on their business, you'll find a lot of people that don't have those annual member minutes, those annual board meeting minutes. And those can be so important just to try to show the court that this isn't just a facade, that you were really truly running this particular business entity. And the last thing is to make sure that you don't commingle assets or to be undercapitalized. So those are just some food for thought there on the business entity. Any other follow-up with that, Stephanie?
No, I think that's spot on. You've got to create these business entities, but also maintain and operate it like a business. And it's some somewhat simple things that you can incorporate, and there's just a lot of advantages for doing so. And again, I mean, like we've said over and over, we're in a COVID world right now, so some of the things we're talking about are specific to COVID, but liability waivers, insurance, these business entities, they all should be considered and implemented in an everyday, before COVID, after COVID, during COVID situation.
Yeah. So to debrief, I think that we hit 5 main areas, one being the liability waivers, 2 being compliance with the law, right? Whatever that is at the state, local, and federal level at the time of the show. And along those same lines, having a backup plan. Number 3, thinking about signage and other things for reasonable care. 4, insurance. And then 5, the corporate entity. Does that pretty much cover?
Yeah, I think so. And it seems like it's a lot, but if it can save you, like you said, it'll save you a lot of heartache in the long run if you do some things up front to prevent problems in the future.
So advice to our listeners, Stephanie, that are planning a livestock show right now in July or August, and what would be your biggest piece of advice to those folks?
Well, the biggest one is just stay up on the laws and regulations for the federal level, the state level, county, and then in specific cities where you're going to be. So you're going to have to stay on top of that and monitor it I mean, up until and during the show, like you're going to have, that's my biggest piece of advice is make sure you're following all those guidelines and know, follow some of the things we've brought up here today, but also know that you might have to be flexible. I know that we're all ready to get back out there and live our lives like we were before, but just be smart and stay informed and be flexible. And I think that will serve you well to protect yourself and the exhibitors, and also still let you have a show, hopefully, because Carrie and I have talked about this. These livestock shows are pretty important. They were pretty important to us growing up and still are today. And so we need to do our part to keep things safe, so that we can continue to have those in the future.
Thanks, Stephanie, so much for coming back to the podcast. Where can folks find you online? Are you on any social?
Yeah, you can just look up my name on all media of social media. You can find my contact information on the Rinker Law website or my own website at bradleyfriarcouncil.com. So emails and phone numbers are located on those sites.
All right, excellent. And that's www.rinkerlaw.com. And I know Stephanie is very active both on Facebook and Instagram. So thanks again for coming back.
Yeah, thanks for having me.